Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The flight was routine until it wasn't. Serena Malone sat in the cramped economy seat of Flight 423 from Chicago to Seattle, staring out the small oval window. The plane hummed steadily, the vibrations familiar beneath her fingertips. The constant, rhythmic whirring of the engines soothed her, a small comfort in a world that had become increasingly difficult to navigate. But beneath the surface, something stirred. The unease she'd felt all morning hadn't settled. The air was thick, dense with the collective anxiety of hundreds of passengers, their restless energy barely hidden behind polite smiles and half-formed conversations. In the seat next to Serena, a young mother juggled a toddler's tantrum with calm desperation. In front of her, a businessman tapped his fingers incessantly on the tray table, his nervous energy palpable. Serena understood that feeling all too well. Once she had known what it was like to be at the center of attention, to be a highly decorated Air Force pilot with a sharp mind and faster reflexes. But that was before the crash. Now she sat quietly among strangers, hiding her past behind a thick wall of silence. She wasn't a pilot anymore. She was just a woman, on a plane, traveling home. 6 years had passed since the accident, but the pain, physical and emotional, was still fresh. She hadn't flown since. A deep scar marked her life, and the thought of it was always there, lurking beneath the surface. But today, it was different. Today the pressure was mounting, and she couldn't help but feel the weight of it. Then the plane jolted. At first, it was slight, almost unnoticeable. But then, the second jolt came, followed by the unsettling drop of altitude. Serena's heart jumped into her throat. The woman next to her gasped, clutching her child closer to her chest. Serena's hands gripped the armrest instinctively, her fingers digging into the metal. She could feel the difference, the subtle unease in the vibrations that no one else seemed to recognize. This wasn't normal. The flight attendants began to rush down the aisle, their calm demeanor starting to fray at the edges. The overhead lights flickered as the plane descended again. The calm routine of the flight was shattering, and Serena's mind snapped into action. Something was wrong. Something big. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, shaky at first. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Please remain calm." Serena's heart sank and her stomach churned. She had seen this before. The way the cabin went eerily still when things started to go wrong. It was the calm before the storm. The fear was building, silent but heavy. The passengers around her glanced nervously at one another, unsure whether to speak or stay silent. She wanted to scream for them to stay calm, but she couldn't. Her throat was tight. The memories of being in command during times like this came rushing back, and for a moment, she let herself go to that place. The place where she had once taken charge, where she had the answers, the training to fix it all. She snapped her eyes shut, shaking off the memories. Not today, not anymore. Then the plane lurched again. This time, it was more violent. Serena's eyes snapped open as the oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartment, filling the cabin with gasps and cries of panic. The world was starting to spin out of control. She wasn't ready. Serena's breath caught as the aircraft shook violently. Her heart raced, and her palms were slick with sweat. She could hear the screams and the gasps of the passengers around her. Some were clutching their seats, others were staring wide-eyed, unsure of what to do. "Serena," a voice called from beside her, snapping her back to reality. She turned to face the flight attendant standing beside her, her face white with terror. "The captain, he's called for you. He needs help." Serena's body froze. She hadn't flown in years. She had left that part of her life behind. But something inside her stirred, the remnants of training, of instinct. She had to help. The flight attendant guided Serena toward the cockpit. The sound of her heartbeat thundered in her ears as they approached the door. She hadn't been inside a cockpit in years, hadn't touched the controls in 6 long years, but it felt like she had never left. Her fingers itched for the familiar yoke, the sensation of the plane under her control. The door swung open with a soft creak, and Serena's eyes immediately went to the captain and co-pilot. The co-pilot was slumped forward, his face pale, his breathing shallow. The captain, his face drenched with sweat, was frantically typing in commands, eyes flicking between the instruments and the screen. "We've lost both engines," he said, his voice tight. "The autopilot is down. We need a miracle." Serena's pulse spiked. She could see the panic in his eyes. They were losing altitude fast. She glanced at the instruments. The right engine was completely dead, and the left was failing. The plane was plummeting toward the ground, and there was nothing left to stop it. "I can help," Serena said, her voice steady. "You're not alone." The captain didn't flinch. He had no choice. "I need you in the co-pilot seat now." Serena stepped forward, her heart racing as she slid into the seat. She didn't hesitate. This was her moment. She felt the controls, her hands instinctively gripping the yoke. The familiar feeling, the weight of it, came rushing back. The plane was hers again. She was back in control. Serena worked quickly, her mind racing as she assessed the situation. She hadn't trained on a commercial jet, but she knew the basics. Lift, thrust, drag, gravity. The flight path was steep, and the terrain below them was unforgiving. She had minutes, maybe less, before they reached a crash zone. "Mackenzie Ridge," she said, reading from the map. "We can land there. It's not ideal, but it's the only option." The captain stared at her in disbelief. "You're sure?" "No choice," Serena said firmly. "We're coming in low and fast. It's the only chance we've got." The captain didn't argue. He simply nodded, his expression hardening. Serena toggled switches, adjusting the aircraft's angle of descent. Her mind moved with lightning speed as she fought to stabilize the plane. She wasn't just saving the mission. She was saving their lives. The terrain below them grew closer, the jagged peaks of the mountains now visible beneath the descending clouds. Every second was critical. The plane's engine sputtered again, a harsh, grinding noise that made Serena's stomach drop. The captain remained silent, trusting Serena's every movement. She was their only hope. The airstrip was in sight, barely visible, just a sliver of hope in a vast expanse of mountains. The makeshift runway had been abandoned for decades, and the runway lights barely illuminated the strip. Serena adjusted the power, calculating the descent. They were coming in too fast, but there was no time for anything else. The plane was low, and the ground was coming up fast. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. This would be a history-making landing, or their final moments. "Brace for impact," she said, her voice cold with determination. She was going to do it. She had to. The wheels hit the runway with a violent thud. The plane skidded, sparks flying, as the tires screamed against the cracked concrete. Serena's heart was pounding, but her hands were steady. This wasn't the first time she'd been under pressure. The plane bounced once, then twice, before finally coming to a halt, mere feet from the forest's edge. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. The plane had stopped. The world outside the cockpit windows blurred as Serena's mind sharpened. The airstrip was within sight, barely visible through the haze of failing engines, the growing storm, and the endless expanse of jagged mountains below. Mackenzie Ridge, an old Cold War-era airstrip, was nothing more than a shadow on the landscape, a forgotten strip of cracked concrete. It wasn't meant for jets. It wasn't meant for anything like this. The plane was dropping faster now, the heavy weight of gravity tugging at it, threatening to pull them into the mountainside. The landscape below grew more hostile. Rocky cliffs and dense snow-covered pine trees awaited them. There was no room for error. Every second was critical. The altitude continued to fall. The plane's right engine sputtered, its faint whine barely audible over the rapid descent. The other engine was completely dead. Serena's breath came in sharp, shallow bursts. She clenched her jaw, staring at the instruments, her hands steady on the controls. The familiar tension in her gut, the same feeling she'd had back in her military days, was creeping in. She wasn't just flying anymore. She was fighting the forces of nature. She was fighting against time. "Serena!" Captain Doyle's voice broke through the hum of the plane. His words were urgent. "We're not going to make it if we keep this descent. We need to pull up. But we can't climb. The engines are dead. We need a miracle." "I know," Serena said, her voice steady despite the chaos unfolding around her. She had no intention of letting them fall out of the sky. She wasn't going down without a fight. She reached for the controls again, her fingers working quickly to adjust the trim, recalibrate the angle of descent. The plane shook, the cockpit lights flickering, and for a moment, the horizon disappeared into the thick clouds and snow. She could feel the weight of it all, the pressure mounting with every passing second. But something inside her clicked, something that had been dormant for so long. She was back in control. Her instincts, her training, kicked in. She could almost hear the voice of her former instructor echoing through her mind. "When you're in the air, there's no panic, only focus, only instinct." Serena had left that life behind, but it had never truly left her. It was still there, buried deep beneath the fear, beneath the scars. The plane continued to plummet, but she didn't flinch. She had one shot at this. "We have to level out now," she said, her voice low but firm. She adjusted the throttle, pushing what little power remained in the right engine. The plane groaned in protest, but it responded. Slowly, the descent slowed, and the nose of the plane rose slightly. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep them in the air. For now. The land below was closer, too close. There was no room for maneuvering, no time to make another attempt. The airstrip was there, a thin sliver of hope. The emergency lights on the makeshift runway flickered in the distance, barely visible, but it was the only chance they had. 3 miles out," Captain Doyle said, his voice laced with disbelief. He looked at Serena, then back at the dashboard, as if hoping the instruments would suddenly come alive. Serena glanced at him, her hands adjusting the yoke. This was it. She had no more time to waste. They couldn't pull up anymore. There was no space to turn. It was a straight shot now. "Make sure the gear's ready," Serena said as she maneuvered the plane closer to the runway. She wasn't sure the landing gear would deploy, but she had to try. One way or another, she was going to land this plane. The captain nodded, scrambling for the manual controls. Serena's eyes flickered to the horizon, to the strip of cracked concrete that they would have to touch down on. The plane dropped again, the nose diving slightly, but Serena caught it, guiding them into a steady, shallow approach. The wind howled outside, battering the fuselage. This was a miracle landing. The airstrip was short, barely wide enough for the plane's massive wingspan. If they overshot it, there was only a cliff. But Serena held her focus, tightening her grip on the controls. No room for mistakes. 2 miles? Doyle called out, his voice tense. The ground rushed closer, too fast. "Flaps!" Serena said, reaching for the switch. There was no hydraulics. The power was down. Everything in the cockpit was manual. The plane rattled, its wings shuddering as they flew closer to the ground. Flaps, she muttered again, desperately trying to slow their descent. It wasn't enough. We have to land it. Now. Serena's breath caught in her throat. She glanced once more at the runway below. It was coming up fast. There was no turning back. Her fingers tightened around the yoke. This was it. The landing. The one that would define everything. The front wheels of the plane scraped the runway with a jarring, bone-rattling thud, and Serena's heart skipped a beat. She pushed the throttle to reverse thrust, trying to slow them down, but the tires screamed in protest as they skidded across the cracked concrete. Sparks flew from the friction, the aircraft shaking violently as it continued to slide. The landing gear shuddered beneath them, and the back wheels slammed down with a brutal force. "Come on, come on," Serena whispered to herself, her hands never leaving the yoke. The plane bucked beneath her, the screech of metal against runway filling the cockpit. They were out of control. They were going too fast, too hard. There was nothing but the desperation to stop. The tires hit a large pothole in the runway, and the entire plane shuddered violently. Serena had to fight to keep the plane on course. One more jolt, and they would be off the edge. "Stop! Stop!" she shouted as the end of the runway loomed closer, trees and rock cliffs just beyond. She had seconds, and then, just when it seemed they wouldn't make it, the plane screeched to a halt, safely. There was nothing. Complete silence. Serena's head was spinning. Her hands were numb. The only thing she could hear was the distant wail of the emergency alarms from the cabin, the soft hum of the dead engines, and her own heartbeat, pounding like a drum in her chest. The plane had stopped. They had landed. Against all odds, they had made it. For a long moment, Serena sat frozen, her hands still clutching the controls. She stared at the tarmac in front of her, trying to comprehend the sheer impossibility of what had just happened. Minutes later, Serena stood outside the plane, the cold air cutting through her military jacket. She glanced around at the emergency responders, the fire trucks, ambulances, and the small crowd of onlookers gathering in the distance. Her legs felt weak beneath her, and she had to steady herself against the wreckage of the plane. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight. She wasn't used to being the hero, but the cameras were already swarming. Reporters shouted her name, snapping pictures of her disheveled form, her face still pale from the adrenaline and the terror of the descent. Serena's stomach churned as the press pushed toward her. She knew what they wanted. The story, the miracle, the hero who saved the day. But that wasn't who she was. A woman in a red coat approached, her microphone held high. "Serena Malone, you were a passenger on that flight, but you took control and saved everyone. How did you do it? What made you act?" Serena looked at her blankly. She hadn't been acting. She had simply done what was needed. But the words wouldn't come. She couldn't tell the truth. Not yet. Not to them. Not when it was still too raw. I was just trying to help," Serena finally said, her voice thick with emotion. She turned her gaze toward the cockpit. She needed to leave, to be somewhere quiet. She didn't want their attention. She didn't want this fame. Her eyes met Captain Doyle's across the tarmac. He was talking to a group of emergency personnel, but he paused when he saw her. There was something in his expression, understanding, support, a silent acknowledgement that he didn't expect her to stay. Not for this. He had seen it in her, even when no one else did. That night, Serena sat in a small room at a local fire station, the sound of helicopters still ringing in her ears. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving only the deep ache of survivor's guilt. Why her? Why not the others? She should have been the one to go down with the plane. She had walked away from the cockpit years ago for a reason. She wasn't fit to be a hero. She ran a hand through her hair, staring at the glowing emergency light outside the window. The whole night had been a blur. The press, the accolades, it all felt like a dream. But the reality settled in when a knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Serena? It was Captain Doyle again, standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "I just wanted to thank you," he said quietly, his voice still hoarse. "I've been flying for 25 years. I've seen a lot of things. But what you did, I've never seen anything like it." Serena swallowed, unsure of what to say. She didn't want praise. She didn't want anyone telling her how brave she was. "I didn't do it for the praise," she said, her voice shaky. "I just did what I was trained to do." Captain Doyle's expression softened. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "I know you didn't. But that's why you're different. You didn't freeze. You didn't panic." Serena's eyes locked with his, and for a moment she saw respect. Not for the landing, but for the person she was. "None of this should have happened," she murmured, her voice cracking. "I should have never stopped flying. If I had kept training, maybe I could have stopped it before it got this bad. But I didn't." Captain Doyle shook his head. "No one could have predicted that. No one could have stopped it. What you did wasn't just instinct. You saved lives. And not just as a pilot, but as a person." Serena didn't know how to respond. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of the crash and everything that had followed was still too much. The morning after the crash was quiet. The reporters had finally left. The emergency crews had packed up and gone. The world, it seemed, was starting to move on. But Serena was still there, still trapped in the memories of the flight. The news of her actions had spread across the nation. She had become an unexpected hero, someone whose story had captivated millions. But for Serena, this wasn't about fame. It was about finding peace. She stood at the edge of the tarmac, her gaze shifting between the small private aircraft parked on the runway. The morning sun was rising, casting long shadows across the ground. For the first time in years, Serena felt a sense of hope. The military had reached out. They wanted her back. They wanted to give her another chance. She had earned it. But more than that, she had earned her own forgiveness. Serena inhaled deeply, feeling the weight of the decision settle in. She wasn't just a survivor. She wasn't just the woman who saved a plane. She was someone who had the chance to start over, to take control of her future again. The decision was hers to make, and for the first time in a long while, Serena felt ready.